Raphael Tay. And next, founding partner of Chung Chambers President, IPCC Malaysia, Ms. Patricia Chung Wei Ling. And next, Senior Director, Strategic Negotiation, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, Ms. Arividya Arimuto. And allow me to introduce and hand over the program to our moderator for this fourth session. Let's welcome Ms. Tricia Yeoh, CEO, Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, IDEAS. I may now hand over this session to Ms. Tricia Yeoh.
Good afternoon, everyone. Salam Sejahtera. And my name is Tricia Yeoh. I'm the CEO of IDEAS, Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, Malaysia. I understand that this will be, one of the more difficult sessions because we're like in the late afternoon siesta time and so on. But I hope that the session will be very invigorating. It's a very, very important topic that we're talking about today on stage. The session is titled, How Can Halal Businesses Benefit from Multilateral Trade Agreements? And with me here, we have very distinguished panel of speakers. First, on my right, we have Ms. Arividya Arimutu. She is the Senior Director for Strategic Negotiations at MITI, and she is the Chief Negotiator for the CPTPP, which is something that everyone here should be aware of. Malaysia is currently negotiating to possibly ratify the CPTPP, hopefully this year. We'll hear more from her later. Ms. Arividya holds a Master of Laws in International Business and Corporate Law from Lancaster University, a Bachelor of Laws, LLB from University of London, UK, and she's also a chevening scholar. She's spent some time in other parts of the world. She's also been seconded to the World Bank, and she's been in Brussels. So a great honor to have Arividya with us on stage. We also have, to her right, Mr. Raphael Tay. Raphael is the head of corporate, commercial, and M&A practice and has an extensive experience. Actually, his CV is really, really long, so I'm not going to read all of it, but obviously has a lot of experience in multinationals. He has been, actually there was one thing that I saw which I have to point out, which is that he's got a very interesting award. He was the top 15 M&A lawyers, one of the top 15 M&A lawyers in Asia, 2022. So that's something that I thought we should all benefit from knowing. And last but not least, on his right, we have Patricia Chung Wei Ling. She's the founding partner of Chung Chambers and the president of IIPCC Malaysia, which is the International Intellectual Property Commercialization Council, Malaysia chapter, which is a permanent observer of the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. So anyone who follows IP issues will know that WIPO is the main organization to be aware of. And I think she's really excited about IP issues, which is also very relevant for us today. Okay, so the topic for today, we've heard so much about halal the whole day. We know, for example, that the halal industry globally is targeted to reach about 10 trillion ringgit by 2024. But I just want to highlight some data, perhaps in Malaysia, for example. So we know that in Malaysia, there are 8,000 companies that have halal certification. Out of these 8,000, only 1,800 of them are exporters and 1,300 of them are SMEs. And even though there are 8,000 with halal certification, actually many, many more are involved in the halal industry. So 200,000 of the 1.3 million businesses in Malaysia are involved in halal. So we know that there's a great, I think we've also heard this term, ecosystem being used a lot today. There are a lot of companies involved in the halal ecosystem in Malaysia. But I think when it comes to trade agreements, I think this is where the vast majority of SMEs and industry have no clue how they could benefit from these multilateral trade agreements that Malaysia is signing. We are already a signatory and participatory of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was concluded, widely hailed as a success. But what does this really mean for them? And with the CPTPP, the advance of that coming up as well, will they actually gain any benefits from that? So there is a general discussion about SMEs more broadly, but we also want to narrow it down to the halal sector. How will the halal industry really benefit from this? So I have a list of questions, and I'm sure more questions will come about. But for now, I'd like to pass the time to the speakers. Each of them will get about, I think you have been given about 10 minutes, but I think it's fine if you want to speak for less than that. And then we'll have a discussion on stage. So first, I will invite Ms. Arividya Arimutu from the Ministry of International Trade and Industry to give her first intervention. So please, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Trish. I hope everyone can hear me. Good afternoon. I'm Arividya. I'm the Senior Director for Strategic Negotiations at MITI, and I'm the Chief Negotiator for CPTPP, and I work on a number of other free trade agreements as well. Before I continue, could I get a show of hands? How many of us here have an inkling or an idea of what a free trade agreement means? Anyone? When I say FTAs or free trade agreements, does anyone have an inkling what that might mean? I mean, it's okay not to know. No? Okay, I see one hand, a couple of hands at the back. Okay. It's important that I know this so that I don't go into technical details of GATS and GATT and what that means, because then there's no point. So free trade agreements are treaties that Malaysia negotiates. It could happen bilaterally or regionally. So sometimes Malaysia embarks on these negotiations on a bilateral basis. That means Malaysia gets into talks with another country, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, for example. We negotiate bilaterally to arrive at a set of disciplines and rules that would govern trade between these two countries. Part of that agreement will also contain concessions in the form of removal of duties or reduction of duties, which will enable goods to travel between these two countries using a reduced rate or a preferential treatment. So simply put, Malaysia with another country or a set of countries, we enter into an agreement. That agreement contains a set of obligations and disciplines and rules, and it also offers concessions to the parties in that agreement to be able to trade in a preferential manner. Malaysia does this in multiple ways. For example, if we do it bilaterally, it's called the Bilateral Free Trade Agreement, and Malaysia has 7 of those. So we have bilateral agreements with Australia, with New Zealand, with Japan, with India, with Pakistan, with Chile, with Turkey. Malaysia also does it through ASEAN. These are called regional trade agreements, and we have 8 of those. So ASEAN has trade agreements with China, Japan, Korea, India. It also has a recent one called the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and that involves ASEAN and 5 other countries: China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So when I say rules, what does that mean, and how would that impact business people like yourselves? So if you are in the export-import business, you would know that for you to produce or manufacture a product, it involves raw materials as well as intermediate goods. So if you want to produce a phone, for example, a lot of inputs go into this product. There's the electronic sector, there's the plastic sector. It could also involve other materials like chemicals. And all these products, either in the form of raw materials or intermediate goods, go into a finished product. That's how you get a phone. When you have trade agreements, the agreements allow you to bring in those inputs from the countries that are parties to that agreement using a preferential duty rate. So if you want to look at the ASEAN-China FTA as an example, you could bring in inputs from ASEAN countries as well as China, manufacture in Malaysia, and then that product will get preferential duties either in ASEAN countries or China. If you look at RCEP, when you have more countries involved in a trade agreement, you are able to source raw materials from more countries. There are 15 countries in RCEP, which means you are able to source raw materials from 15 countries at preferential duty rates, manufacture a product, and then you're able to export that product to those 15 countries, again using preferential duty rates. Now, preferential duty rates can have a major impact when it comes to exports, and that's because even a duty as low as 5% or 6% will have an impact on the margin of profit for an exporter and an importer. So in a trade agreement, when we remove those duties, Malaysian exports will enjoy a competitive edge. So in an agreement where Malaysia is a party to, and you're able to enjoy certain preferences, your exports will enjoy competitive edge over products originating from countries that do not have an FTA arrangement in the export market of the country you're exporting to. An example I always use is South Africa, for example. South Africa doesn't really have the kind of FTA network that we do. And when we export and you're competing with South African products, then our product will have a competitive edge because we get preferential duty rates. So that simply put is what the FTA does for goods. Now, an FTA covers a number of other areas in addition to goods, but I thought the goods example would be most relevant to the halal sector. Another area is, of course, services. If we are looking at halal-related services, that's also an area where you'll get an advantage from an FTA because, again, FTAs are used to create more liberal markets that will accord certain preferences to the parties of the free trade agreement. It's difficult to pinpoint that certain sectors in the halal industry will benefit more than others because I think the idea of halal applies to a number of sectors. So if you're in the F&B sector and you're looking at halal, or if you're in the pharmaceutical sector, you're looking at halal, or you're in the cosmetic sector looking at halal, you will still be able to gain benefits from an FTA because the preferences that the FTA accords doesn't look at halal versus non-halal. It looks at specific product sectors. So if you're producing cosmetics and you want to export cosmetics, then you will still be able to avail yourself of the concessions and the preferential duties that are in an FTA, whether or not that product is a halal product. The same thing applies for food products or beverages. If you're exporting food items or snacks or seafood or chicken or shrimps, then what the FTA does is that it accords a set of preference and duty concessions to those goods. What would be an advantage for the halal sector, in my view, is one, it helps you improve certain standards. I know that in Malaysia, we look at hygiene standards as part of the overall halal standards. So when you are exporting something with the Malaysian certification of halal, there is a certain reputation and hygiene standard that's attached to it. So that will also create some sort of competitive edge for Malaysian products in foreign markets. In addition, we know that there is a demand for halal goods, especially in the Middle East and in countries where there is a rising number of Muslim population. So we know that there is a demand globally for halal products and services. So having that certification will help you in the sense that there's a certain level of standard and reputation attached to it. So two major points before I stop. Number one, when it comes to duty concessions and reduction or removal of import duties, this applies to all products. So when we enter in an FTA, we will request our trading partner to remove duties, to reduce duties on our exports entering that country's market, and that will happen irrelevant of the halal status. And secondly, when you look at standards and certification, when certain products carry the Malaysian halal certification, it comes with a certain reputation, and therefore, it will still create a competitive edge for Malaysian halal products and services. So I think I'll stop there, Trish.
Okay, thank you so much, Arividya. That's a very good summary. I hope that those in the audience who had not really understood the advantages an FTA could provide to us now can possibly see some potential advantages. But I think if there are businesses in the hall today, you might want to start thinking about which parts of the FTAs or which parts of these multilateral trade agreements could actually be advantageous to you. How does it apply to your actual industry itself? All right. The next speaker we have, Mr. Raphael Tay. Raphael happens to be the thorn amongst the roses on stage today. Thank you for being here with us. Raphael does have a set of slides that he's going to share with us. And please put them up now. Thank you very much. All right. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Trish. Really, it's a thorn among the roses, which I really feel quite intimidated today. Not a position that I'm quite accustomed to, but nevertheless, I'm in very good company. Yes, what I want to limit my slides to really is 4 slides. The first 2 talks about RCEP, and then the other 2 talks about halal and how SMEs can take advantage of it. So the first slide, if you can go to the first slide, I have 10 different benefits, key benefits to Malaysian businesses. I know Arvidya didn't touch a lot of them because I think he just wanted to keep it short and simple. But really, I'm not going to try to go through all of them, but merely just to highlight to you some of the things which are fairly important. Now, the rules of origin really is one of the most critical issues in free trade agreements because really it is about the origin of the goods and where the raw materials are imported from, which cumulatively comes to the decision as to what is the cumulative rule for the rules of origin insofar as RCEP is concerned. Now, it's only 40%, so actually it's quite low as far as free trade agreements are concerned. Free trade agreements, Arya may correct me on this, but I think typically 60% or thereabouts. Not necessarily, no, yeah, but not in ASEAN, but generally speaking, yeah, ASEAN is a bit lower than that. Trade in goods is something we talked about. Trade in services, the liberalization of the service sector is up to 65%. I think what's important to understand that whilst countries are committed to liberalization of trade in services, I think they have up to 6 years to comply with that in RCEP. Investments is another thing. There's a prohibition on performance requirements. In other words, you cannot have restrictions built into foreign investments. E-commerce is quite interesting. In terms of this pillar of e-commerce, I think one of the most important things is the acceptance of electronic signatures among RCEP countries. That's actually quite important. And my next slide is the other 5 pillars. Intellectual property, single application, very important. Customs procedure and trade facilitation, that will be simplified. That will make you exporting your goods to RCEP countries a lot easier. Competition, there is supposed to be a maintenance of competition law regimes, which I think most of RCEP countries already have, bar 1 or 2. Government procurement, that's new. Basically, it says that government procurement must be transparent and it must be open to tender opportunities to companies from other RCEP countries. And non-tariff measures. So those are the 10 very broad pillars of RCEP. What is important to understand is 2 things. I think we're going to concentrate today's discussion on trade goods and and in terms of the origin of these goods. So I think that's a very, very important aspect, and I think that's how the halal industry together with SMEs can leverage on this. Now, my next slide talks about the Muslim population in RCEP countries. You will note that Australia has got a Muslim population, 650,000. Brunei, of course. Cambodia has got a large Muslim population. China, Indonesia, Japan. South Korea is actually somewhat smaller. Laos is small. Malaysia is 16 million. Myanmar is 2 over a million. New Zealand, 41,000. And Philippines, 7 million. So the total Muslim population in RCEP countries made up of 292 million out of a 2.3 billion population in RCEP, which comes to about 13% of the total population of RCEP. Now, 13% may sound a very small number, but really it's not when you look at the absolute numbers, which is 292 million. So the opportunities for the halal industry is actually huge. And it's very important to concentrate because we're going to talk about halal industry now. Now, how would the halal industry benefit from this? I'd like to throw this idea to you, and this is this. With RCEP, there is already a liberalization in trade, right? Which is open to all businesses, whether halal or non-halal. But what is more important is this. The halal certification that JARKIM in Malaysia issues is a standard which is being followed globally within the halal ecosystem. And if you're a halal manufacturer, or you're a manufacturer, whether F&B or whatever, if you're a halal manufacturer, it means that you can take advantage of the trade liberalization within RCEP, as well as a halal certification, assuming you have that halal certification. Now, this morning, Amna, the speaker, Puan Amna, talked about Indonesia pushing the halal standard and possibly being a global standard within the next couple of years. I was excited, but I felt threatened as well. I felt threatened because as a Malaysian, I think we had the first mover advantage. But I don't think we're making use of that advantage. And if Indonesia manages to move itself in the holistic manner, I think the Malaysian halal certification might be pushed to, at best, second or third. So I think we need to apply our minds together now. And how do we create opportunities for our halal industries in Malaysia? Now, Gojek, Tunku Mufi, I was very, very impressed that Gojek is not just a rider, a food, a Go Food, or a mobile app for rides. But if you look at what he said just now, a moment ago, you realize that what Gojek is also doing is creating a halal ecosystem. Now, in Malaysia, unfortunately, for many of us, when we talk about halal, it is confined to food, production, restaurants, right? But really, when you understand the halal certification and ecosystem, it's far wider than that. I think Datuk Sri Michael this morning too made a very good point when he said that the logistics industry is also halal certified. Now that's very important. And he was talking about how Japan, and they were trying to get certification for its halal certification for the logistics industry in Japan. Now, so you can see there is widespread interest. So halal ecosystem is not just food, it's not just restaurants, but it's an entire standards ecosystem. I think what's important, and I'm going to say this, and I'm probably in the danger of being, stepping on a few toes, But what is important, the way I look at it, is that for the halal certification system, standards in Malaysia, to be exported globally, it has to think out of the box. And I'll leave my comments as that, and perhaps we can discuss that later. And my final slide is really just what are the benefits of RCEP to the global halal industry. Many of them you are fairly familiar with, we have talked about. But generally speaking, it is the benefits of this is actually huge. Liberalization of trade within RCEP and halal certification is actually the new way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raphael. You sort of dangled us over there, you know. You said, we need to think outside the box, and I'll leave you there. So that's something that I'm going to have to come back to, but I will remember it because I've written it down. So now we've come to the last speaker, Patricia, who will not have slides, but Patricia will hopefully speak more about the relationship between IP, trade, and then how does that apply to the halal market in Malaysia. All right, over to you.
Thank you, Tricia. Please allow me to stand. I think we have been sitting all day already. Actually, today, I find it very interesting and excited because today we are covering the multilateral trade agreements. But of course, my area is always on intellectual property commercialization or IP. Sad to say, most of the IP conferences, we are revolving around IP litigation, enforcement, registration. Why am I so excited today? Because I finally can share something else, which is much more related to business and commercial. So I think that will be the third vertical, I would say. Okay, and before I start my sharing, probably everyone might want to look at a short video before I start that. Shall we? Thanks.
Is there any sound? Patricia, the video is supposed to have sound, is
Yes. Can you share the sound if you don't mind?
Is it possible to put the video up on the large screen as well? Okay, that works, but no audio.
While they are sorting out some technical issues, probably I'll just touch a bit on this multilateral. I think we heard a lot today, and I was actually amazed with what Puan Amna shared earlier on from Serunai. Whatever they have right now as a mechanism to actually, I would say, to resolve the issue on counterfeits, people dare to put fake halal. I think that is also an alarming issue for Malaysia itself. I think with the digital era and the emergence of technology, everyone is looking to the digital world right now, having a virtual appearance for your businesses, whether services or products, right? Having said that, do you actually encounter, whether your scale of business, big or small, you do encounter a lot of infringing goods issue. Someone probably copied your brand, we call it trademark, your design, whether it's under industrial design, copyright, or even your technology. They have been just uploading it without asking for your permission. Is that right? We also have latest reported cases, from Malaysia about Shopee, against the wellness company. But the judgment have been delivered layman term. As a digital e-commerce service platform provider, they don't have the technical capacity to cover that. So, sad to say, they have to deliver in a way to say that you can actually follow through whatever Shopee platform to lodge your complaint and whatnot. They will actually process your complaint and take down the necessary. But every one of us know this will keep coming back, right? How many times you have to do that for the complaint and take down, and the next thing, another anonymous fella put it out again. So this will be endless. So when I said, I was actually amazed because what Sarunai did is excellent. You can just trace it. So since halal, market, you do have this kind of solution, why not pursue for halal certification? And they have the solution for you to track all those things once you get yourself certified and whatnot. So I thought that is interesting that I have to highlight it. And I think Mr. Raphael covered quite a lot on, comprehensive benefits already from the multilateral, especially RCEP. And of course, there's actually one header that you can see talking about IP, right? And yeah, I understand, probably to your, it's a bit technical, but have to let you know there's actually heated up debates out there. But no worries, because what I'm trying to show you all as a video is actually a program just completed on the 27th May to 3rd June. It's called My IPCom 22. The whole objective of this flagship program by RIPCC, which is an international NGO, we are Permanent Observer WIPO, which have been introduced by Tricia earlier on. Our objective here is that to make sure each and every counterpart has a voice to speak about IP globally. And of course, as a president for IPCC Malaysia chapter over here, I need to ensure Malaysia has a voice. And in order for us to build a healthy ecosystem for IP, everyone has to be involved. Each and every one of you play a vital role in this ecosystem. Why I said that? If the market leaders, startup, SMEs, be it in a halal or non-halal market, you are the one generating GDP, right? So with the involvement of our regulators over here, like Ms. Arya, so she has been actually involved in this. And in our program itself, we also have other like KPDNA, SHIPI, we have Martrade, we have MyIPO, TDA. These are all the relevant stakeholders to build the ecosystem. Why? Because if they understand the context better, they will come up with a lot of blueprints whereby you gain the benefit from the grants, incentive, tax exemption, revolving around IP. And why IP is so relevant to RCEP? Why are you here today? We are dealing with business. We are talking about making profits over here. What are you trading? Your own services? Your product? But what are they actually, to be specific? Have you already identified them? Everyone probably know about branding lah. That is the simple one, called trademark. Do you actually aware that Trademark Act 2019, which have been implemented around December 2019, has already made a trademark a collateral? What is that? Through the law, by right, you are able to pledge your trademark to the bank for loan. But the law is ready, other things have not. So we have to do our part, each and every one of us, to increase the awareness, involve all the relevant stakeholders so that IP commercialization can move. Probably a lot of people might be thinking, this halal, market, a lot of them not doing so much export. So later of the time, probably I will also cover, right after the video. Is the video ready? No sound. Okay. Okay, we have to watch without audio, it seems. But anyhow, just long story short for this, probably a lot of people might be thinking, halal market, RCEP, is like a very heavy thing for me. But in fact, with RCEP, we standardize everything, right? So everyone just follow through a guide. But I would say I'm glad that, Matrade, that time I think Yang Mulia Rajabadro, he did actually mention that Malaysian government have been looking into rectifying, the RCEP so that it can actually harmonize our IP protection. So this is actually a good thing for us. Then Malaysian business owner over here, halal or non-halal market, you can actually tap with RCEP and gain most benefits out of which, like what Mr. Raphael have shared earlier on. So I think that part is actually much more technical. You don't worry so much. In fact, what you need to do right now, aware about the importance of IP. Let's say today, I give you an example. We have exhibition beside, right? Okay, put yourself into someone's shoes. They are not aware so much about the importance of IP. So the first thing they do, they put in a lot of effort, set up necessary booth and whatnot. The next thing, I'm talking about the exhibition probably in the overseas. Then you're not familiar so much with the market over there, right? So you set up your booth, your big brand is over there, and you are doing demonstration with whatever, visitor walking through your booth. The next thing is, you have been lodged with a complaint. Sent with a legal notices and disease. What's that? That means people is taking action against you, warning you, infringing someone's patent, probably, copyright, design, or trademark. Why? Because we always feel so excited because we can go abroad, right? We want to exhibit our services, right, and our products. But what we're not aware about, we don't usually check. Do we have the freedom to operate? This is the term you should remember. What you need to do, you have to cross-search first. Let's say today you have a trade exhibition in Germany, and these are the people, they understand IP very much, and they already secured your brands under trademark, technology under patent and whatnot, but you are, someone new, tapping into the trade show or trade exhibition, thinking that, yes, my business finally go abroad. But before you can actually shine, within a short period, you have been chased out from the exhibition room. Because you did not check it out. You have been crossing line, right? So this is what we call export threats. And a lot of people might be thinking, export threats, but my business is very small. Don't mention about export at this juncture. But not forgetting, did you sell things on the e-commerce platform? Yes. So are you doing business outside from Malaysia? Yes. It's just that you probably outsource the delivery services to someone else and whatnot. But all these things you should look into because you don't know how risky you are in this kind of business. Like what Ms. Arya mentioned about the phone and whatnot, a lot of people might be thinking, okay, I just do rebranding, or I'm just into OEM. I take someone's recipe, I repack it. A big no-no. Why? Because a lot of people don't understand when we talk about secret recipe, what's that actually? It's actually your traditional knowledge, right? From your ancestor, right? Probably, or you created yourself. But if you don't understand the importance, you probably might be thinking, oh, someone want to get a franchise from me. Okay lah, they pay me handsomely. So they ask me to disclose A to Z. So I disclose A to Z. So the next thing, habis lah. No more business because you created your own business. You have disclosed everything to someone. But in fact, you can actually choose to retain certain things and only those you need, you can actually license out. You license it out, probably by pace or whatnot. So these are what revolving around IP commercialization. Many of you already tap into IP commercialization without you knowing it, right? And some, OEM or ODM company, and we have a lot of fabricators here, whether big or small, even not into technical, probably doing some, repacking, but they have to sort out some technical solution, how to measure or whatnot, the container and whatever. But all those things, they might be thinking, I rebrand for someone else, not me. So I don't bother about IP. No. You heard about Microsoft suing Foxconn, right? So Foxconn is actually, doing a OEM earlier on. But they finally understand the importance of IP. So they have to patent the process. So the program that we are running is to educate business owners, startups, entrepreneurs, to learn about IP importance, how to commercialize it, to make money out of which, and get the first-hand info from the relevant stakeholders like our regulators and whatnot, to gain benefit, because funding is always the crucial issue, right? A
Patricia,
barrier for
maybe
a
you
lot of
can
people.
start to wrap up.
Yeah, sure. The video, if it is not working, probably we will just play it, a quick one. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the reminder.
Thank you.
Can you flash it over there as well? Okay, I'll just introduce a bit since there's no audio. This was actually held at AIAC, Asian International Arbitration Center. We are trying to promote the venue also so that globally, if we encounter any disputes when we are dealing with trading or IP, at least foreign people would actually know about AIAC from Malaysia. The event was actually officiated by our YB, Dato Sri Alexander Nanta Lingi from KPD and HCP. And the event was co-organized by Samantha SME Association, which is the longer establishment in Malaysia, having more than 3,500 members right now. And we have 23 countries, delegates joining in. It's a hybrid event. We have around 1,000 delegates at time. And we also have a premium supporting partner from MSIA, Malaysia Semiconductor Industry Association. This is the president, Dato Sri Wong Siu Hai. This is the chairman of My IPO, Dato Razali. And this is a board member from Hong Kong, Johnson Kong. The program actually have 2 plenary sessions and 6 panel discussion involving 23 countries, the speakers from different jurisdictions. We also have judges from China, Guangdong. And we have brand owner like Nokia, P&G, Marks and Clarks. And we also have a Singapore IP investment banker. They were sharing RCEP for this session. This is IPCC chapter from DC, Washington just now.
How long is the video?
And we actually did touch about IP in the halal market during the program. Quite sad, right? No audio. Yeah, they are all entrepreneurs. Yep, that's all. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you so much, Patricia. So evidently there's a lot of work that has been going on out there in the IP world, IP commercialization. So I think the point here is, can we actually register for patents, copyrights, trademarks, for all of the things that you see, right, in the expo out there? Can we actually register for, I don't know, you mentioned like traditional homemade recipes, many of those things, that the little jurokes and all these things that you're bottling up, what can we do to preserve the rights over those over those products, and it's not just about goods. Okay, I'm just going to kind of circle back a little bit to some of the comments that you've already made. So I think there is a consensus on the stage here that all three of our speakers believe that Malaysia signing on to these FTAs, free trade agreements, or multilateral trade agreements is a good thing. It's a good thing because the local businesses in Malaysia can thrive, can take advantage of all these potential benefits, and Mr. Raphael spelled out like 10 different areas that we could benefit from that. But I think I just want to challenge the panel a little bit. So one of the things that we often hear outside is that not just among the halal sector, even the non-halal sector, SMEs in Malaysia, we have thousands and thousands. The SMEs really form the backbone of the country. But it's a small percentage of them that are exporting. And I mentioned that in the beginning as well. We have, 8,000 halal registered companies, but only a small proportion of that are exporting. So how can we make that argument stronger that the trade agreements can actually be helpful? Or is it the point that we want to push the SMEs to become exporting? Like, do you think that is the eventual goal that we want them to reach towards? So I think both those things, right, would be a relevant thing to answer. Like, challenges, what are the challenges that these SMEs out there would face? And then what would be the goal to, I suppose, counter those challenges? And then later, Raphael, I will come back to your, your tempting comment earlier. So maybe you want to start, Ari?
Thank you again, Trish. I think before I get to that question, I just want to spend a little bit of time perhaps providing a little bit more clarifications on some of the very pertinent points raised by Raphael as well as Patricia. Now, that would also be a good segue to respond to your question with regards to challenges faced by SMEs when it comes to optimizing the benefits that accrue from some of these multilateral trade agreements. Let's look at this table. When I look at this table, I know at least 3 sectors are involved in the manufacturing of this table. There's wood, there's probably glass and ceramics, and there's metal. When we talk about exporting to ASEAN and using agreements like RCEP or ATIGA, one of the things SMEs will need to think about would be rules of origin, and that's what Raphael touched upon. For you to be able to get the tariff concessions offered in a trade agreement, let's take ATIGA or RCEP, for example. A lot of the products traded within ASEAN are duty-free. So if you want to export a Malaysian product to Vietnam or even to RCEP countries, chances are that product will receive duty-free treatment. But how do you establish that a product is a Malaysian product? If you're exporting this table, how do you tell the Vietnamese authorities or the Chinese authorities under the ASEAN-China Agreement or ATIGA or RCEP, bearing in mind that it's up to the private sector to pick and choose which free trade agreement is most useful to you? How do you prove that this table is a Malaysian product? This is where the rules of origin come into play. So all the sectors I talked about, wood, glass, metals, you will have to prove that 40% of whatever inputs and goods that go into this table are of Malaysian and ASEAN origin, if you're using an ASEAN agreement, or of Malaysian, ASEAN, and RCEP country origin. So if you're exporting to China, you need to prove that 40% of whether wood or plastic or glass or base metals in this table originate from Malaysia, ASEAN, and China. Now, that's a very simplistic way of explaining rules of origin. There are also very formulaic calculations. If you look at each agreement, it will tell you whether it's calculated based on FOB or ex-works, or you have a choice to use a combination of both. If you're sourcing a particular input and then you're able to prove that there's a change in tariff heading or subheading, these are product-specific rules, all of this will help you prove that this particular product is of Malaysian or ASEAN or RCEP origin, and therefore it qualifies for the tariff concessions or duty reduction that's offered to you from a free trade agreement. Again, as I said earlier, this is a nice segue to respond to Trisha's question, because I think a lot of SMEs do not understand this, are not aware of this, and it's a difficult concept. I know, for example, Honda has an entire unit dedicated to rules of origin. So when it comes to MNCs and bigger players, they have dedicated human resources to look at the rules of origin requirements in every trade agreement that Malaysia enters into. So they're able to decipher those rules, and they're able to use that to their export advantage. That does not happen with SMEs. And I think here, the associations, the private sector does have a bigger role to play. MITI and Matrade go on these outreach sessions. We try to do it at least once every month. We talk about rules in different agreements, and we try to help our local players understand some of these rules. We know that over the years, we've worked a lot with FMM. They do have the expertise, and they also do some of this outreach program with some of the smaller players. So that's, I think, a major challenge for SMEs, understanding the rules of origin and understanding how they can qualify for the preferences coming out of an FTA. Secondly, understanding the preferences are also sometimes difficult. These are thousands of pages of tariff reduction schedules. And when you look at those schedules, sometimes it's difficult for you to know how are countries reducing duties. And I've received many phone calls asking us, which schedule should I look at? Should I look at the import schedule or the export schedule? And I don't blame businesses, because you're not in the business of trade agreements. We are. But we're negotiating it on your behalf. So we do think that there is a little bit of gap there, which I think both the government as well as the private sector needs to address. Secondly, with regards to some of these other multilateral trade agreements, I know we focused much on RCEP, but there are multiple agreements to which Malaysia is party. There are 15 agreements, and you can use any of those agreements. You don't have to necessarily use RCEP. You don't have to necessarily choose a particular FTA, because we are talking about it here. Whatever FTA works for you, whatever export markets you are looking at, that's the FTA which will be most beneficial to you. Lastly, on the subject of IP, I just wanted to highlight that all our treaty obligations also contain specific ideas on IP. It may not necessarily be a very comprehensive chapter, but as a member of the WTO, we adhere to certain international principles when it comes to intellectual property rights. We protect patents for 20 years. We protect trademarks for 10 years. We protect copyrights for 50 years. So if there is a product that you need to get patented or trademarked, I would really encourage SMEs to consult folks like Patricia and get that done. I do think the awareness when it comes to IP is quite low. And although the legal framework is there to accord you protection, that protection is not automatic if you're not going to apply for it or file for an IP. And that's important to do. ASEAN countries are also members of the WTO, so they also have an obligation to protect trademarks and copyrights and patents in their countries, but IP laws are territorial, so if you don't register it in those countries, then you may not get protection in those countries. So all of these are important points for SMEs to think about. And these are also some of the challenges which I think are the reasons why SMEs are not exporting as much as they can. I think only about 17–18% of our exports are attributable to SMEs. Last but not least, let us also not forget that although some of these SMEs, the majority of our SMEs are not exporting, they're still within the ecosystem because they're part of the vendor development program, or they are the tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers to some of these multinationals. Intel has hundreds of SMEs on its vendor list. I know a lot of the MNCs work closely with SMEs. So these SMEs are also part of the export ecosystem indirectly. So when an MNC benefits from trade agreements, those benefits indirectly also help our SMEs. So let's not also forget that. Thank you, Trish.
Thank you. I mean, absolutely wonderful points there. I wish we had more time to unpack that. But I think just maybe on Raphael's side, Raphael, you started talking a little bit about the logistics sector, and I think it also has something to do with what Arividya was saying, right? That you're talking about the supply chain, about how the economy is very deeply integrated, such that ultimately, yes, that's what we want to see. We want to see the SMEs being able to be export ready, so that when the time comes, they can get themselves out. And I think just to clarify one thing, Arividya has been saying things like preferential duty rates and preferential treatment. I think just for the benefit of the audience, what that really means is that you can export more easily, right? You have a better advantage to export to other markets than otherwise, than if Malaysia had not signed those free trade agreements. So Rafael, now can I ask you what you meant when you said that we need to think outside the box? So clearly you're trying to say something. Please elaborate on that.
Thank you, Trish. I think what's important actually is for the halal industry and halal stakeholders and players like yourselves and ourselves to think of halal certification as a subset of a much bigger picture. And that subset is ESG. ESG is globally acceptable now. It's everywhere. Malaysian companies have been penalized for not following ESG principles. Glove manufacturing companies who shall remain nameless, electronic subcontractors, OEM manufacturers of British brands have also had their contracts terminated because of ESG issues, but more specifically modern slavery, human rights in terms of labor conditions. So if you look at halal certification as a subsector of ESG, I think you will have more traction. I think people are more readily acceptable or accepting of halal principles and halal certification. If you look at Indonesia and Malaysia as a reference, the Malaysian halal certification is by JAKIM, which is the religious, it comes from a religious regulator's perspective. But in Indonesia, there has been private sector certification of halal industry. And I think that's something that we have to think out of the box, because one of the things that I have seen and have experienced in Malaysia is that halal certification is seen as a religious food-related certification, as opposed to part of a larger ecosystem of good governance, of hygiene standards, of good ethical practices, and so forth. So I think that's important. It is a mindset that we need to break. And actually, I'm wondering whether or not there will be other government agencies or the private sector in Malaysia, whether or not they will even think about, you look at the ISO, the International Standards Organization. It's a non-governmental organization. Is there going to be an equivalent for the halal industry, the international halal certification? Think about that. Because if you remove halal certification away from the religious sphere, albeit the genesis comes from religion, and I respect it, I think that's very important. But if you remove it outside the jurisdiction of religious bodies, you may find that halal certification becomes a lot more acceptable internationally, not just within the Muslim community, but outside the Muslim community. So that is something that I think if you are going to think about halal industry and the export of halal certification outside of Malaysia, I think we have to think of something different. That was my out-of-the-box thoughts.
Thanks, Rafael. If I may catch you there, so what you're proposing is that halal certification is done by a body other than a religious body. Is this something that happens in other countries?
Well, I stand corrected, but I think in Indonesia, at one stage it was, but I think the government is now bringing it back into the religious ministry. But I think what I'm trying to say is that certification per se doesn't need to be purely religious. It can be a global halal standard based on religious principles, of course, but outside the purview of quote-unquote religious authorities, but an independent authority that gives this certification.
Okay, I mean that's a really interesting perspective, because then now what you're trying to do is to bring up halal from just beyond just among a Muslim
Absolutely,
audience,
absolutely.
but beyond that. So, for example, when I was shopping out, in the Expo, I am actually feeling quite confident because of the products that I'm buying, I know they are healthy, I know they're clean, and for someone like me who's very health conscious, I think this is the market that you want to tap into, right? You're going to tap into an international market that is and remind you, Europe and the US, that's the direction that we're headed towards. They are going to ramp up their regulations, very, very stringent on ESG, on governance, labor rights, and all that. This is the market that we're talking about. So I think it's really exciting, actually, if we can go there. I do have a question for Patricia, but I think I'd also like to just give the audience a chance to ask one or two questions. I will give that privilege over here to Dato', please, Dato', and I do think that's the only question we have time for.
Thank you, Trish. First question is the certification in terms of whether certification can be an anti-tariff, is a non-tariff barrier when some countries start to have a requirement that they have to have their own certification. Number two is your question on certification. Because you look at, there was a tussle before when, CRIM, which is responsible for standardization, they have issued Malaysian standards on halal, on different areas like warehousing. It's only the body to certify, that is, because generally non-halal is all the certification body is the Jabatan Standards. And the body that do the certification is CRIM, which has a big organization that do the ISO 9000, all the product certification to Malaysia, except in the halal area where JAKIM said that they should be the body to do it. And that tussle is something the government has to resolve. Whether JAKIM is the right body or is handed over to international body like ISO, where CRIM is part of the ISO. So they do the standardization and certification of the thing. So my first question is whether certification can be a non-tariff barriers, particularly in large markets when they have the market control, and for smaller countries to come in, they might say that this is my standard, take it or leave it.
Okay, so the question is, could halal certification be a non-tariff barrier? Would Ari take that? Yes.
And how it should be included in the part of the negotiation.
Okay, how to include that as part of the negotiation?
Question is quite easy to answer. Halal certification is not considered a non-tariff barrier. Countries are free to set their standards based on religion, based on their requirements, so long as those measures are in pursuit of a legitimate public policy objective and it's a proportionate trade measure, those measures cannot be considered as non-tariff barriers. So in Malaysia's case, when we talk about halal certification, we have the measure in place in pursuit of a legitimate public policy objective, which is for consumer protection reasons, to ensure that products that enter Malaysia adhere to a certain level of standards when it comes to halal. So yes, it's not a non-tariff barrier. I don't think we have been challenged at the WTO or in our FTA negotiations with regards to halal. Let's look at that from a different perspective now, because that goes to the second question with regards to certification as well as the development of halal industry. So I said earlier that halal certification per se is not a non-tariff barrier, and that's a fact. How do we administer that certification? Are the due processes in place adequate? Should we do better? Because these are questions that have been raised by our trading partners. These are questions that have been raised at least in one free trade negotiation that I was involved in. And one of the things that I have heard from our trade partners is, you're free to administer your halal certification, but can we look at a process that makes it more transparent? When JAKIM goes overseas for certain audit visits, and they then tell that particular plant that you do not qualify for halal certification, can you not give us a recourse mechanism? Can you not tell us how do we do better to comply with JAKIM standards? Can we know where did we fail on the JAKIM checklist? And I think these are fair questions. As a trading nation, I think we should respond to those questions. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, JAKIM is not under MITI's purview. So there's only so much that I can say and do. But I do think that there is a way of administering the certification better. No one is questioning our right to impose halal requirements. No one is questioning our right to impose halal certification. But if we are going to do certification on the basis of availability of resources at JAKIM, and we end up sending audit teams to one particular country, but we are not able to send audit teams to certain countries in the European Union, and they have to wait 2 years or 3 years before a JAKIM team comes down to conduct an audit, to give them the halal certification or renew the halal certification. The bigger question is, are we doing justice to the Malaysian consumers? If we are going to just say all of this depends on the availability or unavailability of resources at JAKIM, we are only able to send X number of teams a year to visit X number of plants and abattoirs, and therefore we can only have X number of plants exporting to Malaysia. Are we doing justice to the Malaysian consumers? I think that's the bigger question. And I'm not sure whether JAKIM representatives are here, but they're pretty aware of MITI's views on some of these areas, because we have received these questions from our trading partners, and I do not think we're addressing those questions adequately. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I do hope that, well, perhaps that will be a message to the organizers. Please include JAKIM in the invitee list next year, in the next conference. Actually, we are really short of time, so I need to ask Raphael and Patricia if you would like to answer any of my questions or Datuk's question, and then please provide your closing statement before we have to end the panel. Maybe Patricia first?
Sure. I think just rewind back a bit, what Tricia asking, how RCEP will be beneficial since most of them not exporting or whatnot. Other than tapping into the digital era, not forgetting the world is moving on collaboration. So nothing to stop, that kind of collaborative initiative like what, Sarunai have actually signed with Interpol or whatnot. So we are bringing, some protection to a certain level to a smaller boy at local level. So that is a great, I would say a great deal, because a lot of big boys plan to penetrate into Malaysia market, and how about the small boy? So we need to strengthen in that, level as well. And I will wrap up my statement by mentioning IP is crucial. Probably a lot of you are not aware about traditional and non-traditional IP. Traditional IP is like patent, design, trademark, copyright, you already know. But non-traditional IP is the big chunk of it. It includes your trade secret, which is your secret recipe, and also domain name, geographical indication, trade dress. So although you are small, probably you want to build your own trade dress. Give an example, when you enter into a shopping mall, probably that is your F&B, you cover up for construction. But when you see it red F&B, automatically you think San Francisco. So you need to build up that kind of trade dress, even come up with a YouTube channel, people will know immediately, oh, that is yours and no one else. So trade dress is under non-traditional IP. Start something simple like this. I believe you will get to tap into export probably, but not by yourself, with your collaborating partner at the end.
All right, thank you. Just to confirm, trade address.
Trade dress.
Trade dress.
Yeah,
Okay.
trade dress.
Right. Okay, thank you. Raphael, your closing statement?
The world waits on no man. Accelerated economic progress, developments post-pandemic is real. Move on. Your market is not Malaysia, your market is the world.
Thank you, Raphael. And Ari, any short closing statement? Because I didn't get you to give your closing statement.
All right, thank you again, Trish. I suppose maybe building on what has been said by my other panelists, perhaps just to reinforce that we are a small trading nation and we embark on trade agreements to create favorable markets for our exporters. So trade agreements are a good thing, and it will continue to be a good thing. It's up to us to make full benefit from those agreements. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Malaysia as a trading nation, I think we all remember historically as well, that's what we started as, right? Malacca as an entrepot. So let's always keep that in our hearts and minds. As we close this session, please join me in thanking the panelists for today, Ms. Arividya Arimutu, Mr. Raphael Tay, and Ms. Patricia Chung. Thank you very much, and I pass the time back to the MC.
Thank you to our moderator. And thank you to our distinguished panelists. And we'd like to invite the CEO of Penang Halal International, Mr. Fazil, to come up to join them for the photo session. So we'd like to invite all distinguished panelists together with our moderator, Ms. Tricia, and Mr. Raphael, Ms. Patricia Chung, Ms. Arividya. Inspiring lectures. How can halal businesses benefit from multilateral trade agreements? Come on, let's give them a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. The fourth session, and we are coming to the last session of our program. And before that, as a token of appreciation to our distinguished panelists, we'd like to invite the CEO of Penang Halal International, Mr. Fazil Irwansom, to present a special souvenir to Mr. Raphael Tay.